What if I told you that the Second Amendment wasn't entirely American? That the right to bear arms, the idea of a well-regulated militia, even the roots of American federalism, had an older sister most people have forgotten. A small, mountainous country, with no king, no standing army, and a population that refused to bow down, even to Napoleon. This is not France. This is not Britain. This is Switzerland. And her story helped shape the United States in ways most Americans have never heard. We talk a lot about 1776, about freedom, guns, the Constitution. But long before Lexington and Concord, before we the people was ever inked onto parchment, there was a place where farmers stood against empires, not with professional armies, but with halberds, pikes, and hunting rifles. They didn't fight for expansion. They fought for home, for independence, and their spirit crossed the Atlantic, straight into the heart of the American experiment. While America was still finding her voice, the Swiss Republic fell to the very kind of centralized power our founders feared most. The question is, did America learn from Switzerland's fall, or are we doomed to repeat it? The Swiss experience had a powerful influence on the American Revolution. It shaped discussions during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and became a point of reference in the political debates of the early American Republic. Long before Switzerland adopted its own modern constitution in the mid-19th century, the old Swiss Confederation, then already 5 centuries old, served as an inspiration for American ideals. It influenced the concepts of resistance to tyranny, independence from foreign powers, neutrality, a citizen militia, and a federal system of government. The Swiss experience had a powerful influence on the American Revolution. It shaped discussions during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and became a point of reference in the political debates of the early American Republic. Long before Switzerland adopted its own modern constitution in the mid-19th century, the old Swiss Confederation, then already 5 centuries old, served as an inspiration for American ideals. It influenced the concepts of resistance to tyranny, independence from foreign powers, neutrality, a citizen militia, and a federal system of government. Looking at Swiss history through the eyes of the American founders helps us understand how stories of resistance became symbols of freedom and courage. In the 17th and 18th centuries, both English and American Republicans saw Switzerland as a beacon of liberty in a continent dominated by kings and empires. Since its founding in 1291, Switzerland had preserved its independence by defeating invasions from Europe's most powerful monarchies. Despite its poverty, its citizen militias, composed of able-bodied men armed with pikes and halberds, held their ground against heavily armored cavalry and standing armies. English Republicans praised this history, and American revolutionaries took it as a model in their own fight against British rule. One voice that stood out was John Zubli, a Swiss-born pastor who moved to America and became a delegate to the Continental Congress from Georgia. In a sermon titled The Law of Liberty, Zubli compared America's resistance to Britain with Switzerland's struggle against Austria. He called Switzerland the only truly free country on earth and reminded his listeners that liberty was the natural right of all people. Zubli retold the famous legend of William Tell. When an Austrian governor placed a hat on a pole and ordered every passerby to bow to it, Tell refused. As punishment, he was forced to shoot an apple off the head of his own young son from a great distance. Tell succeeded, but when asked why he had a second arrow ready, he said it was meant for the governor if his son had been harmed. Tell was imprisoned but escaped, and later ambushed and killed the governor. His act sparked a rebellion that united the original three cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, laying the foundation for the Swiss Confederation. A key reference for the American founders was An Account of Switzerland, published in the early 18th century. This work described in great detail the military traditions and history of the Swiss. One notable episode was the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. When the Austrian Duke Leopold led an army of 20,000 men, the Swiss defenders used the terrain to their advantage. They ambushed the Austrians in a narrow valley, rolling boulders from the cliffs and throwing the invading army into chaos. In the confusion, a much smaller Swiss force attacked with bravery and drove the Austrians out of the country. A key reference for the American founders was An Account of Switzerland, published in the early 18th century. This work described in great detail the military traditions and history of the Swiss. One notable episode was the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. When the Austrian Duke Leopold led an army of 20,000 men into the canton of Schwyz, the Swiss defenders used the terrain to their advantage. They ambushed the Austrians in a narrow valley, rolling boulders from the cliffs and throwing the invading army into chaos. In the confusion, a much smaller Swiss force attacked with bravery and drove the Austrians out of the country. The battle led to the formal creation of the Swiss Confederation. The alliance that had initially been agreed to for only 10 years was made permanent. Over time, more cantons joined this union. The name Eidgenossen, which means oath fellows, was born from this pact, reflecting their shared commitment to defend their freedom. Estimates from the time say the Austrians had 20,000 troops, while the Swiss numbered just 1,400. Yet the smaller force triumphed, and the story became a lasting symbol of the power of unity, courage, and the will to remain free. The Austrians thought they would easily crush a force of peasants, poorly armed, lacking formal discipline. But they were wrong. In one clash, while thousands of Habsburg troops marched into battle, Swiss casualties were minimal, while Austrian losses were overwhelming. In 1386, after Lucerne annexed the town of Sempach, Duke Leopold III launched another campaign to put the Swiss in their place. He brought about 4,000 elite soldiers with him, including noblemen clad in full armor. In contrast, the Swiss had roughly 1,300 men, most on foot, poorly equipped, carrying only halberds. Some even strapped pieces of wood to their arms to deflect the enemy's blows. Before the battle, the Swiss leaders rallied their troops with bold words. If anyone couldn't take on 10 Austrians, they were told to leave the field. A legendary moment followed. A man named Arnold Winkelried is said to have sacrificed himself by gathering enemy spears into his own body, creating an opening for his comrades to break through. The Swiss charged, and by the end of the battle, the Austrians had lost around 2,000 men, including the Duke himself, while Swiss losses were just 200. This small Swiss force, defeating a much larger professional army, captured the imagination of many in Europe. One account even compared the battle at Naples to the ancient Battle of Thermopylae. But unlike the who were wiped out, the Swiss not only held their ground, they won. In fact, 11 stone pillars were erected in the field to mark the places where the Swiss rallied. According to the story, they were pushed back 10 times. But on the 11th charge, they broke the Austrian army. These victories weren't just celebrated in Switzerland. In England, they became part of a wider argument against standing armies, and in favor of citizen militias. A British writer, advocating for a national militia instead of mercenary forces, pointed out that while most of Europe had given way to professional armies, France, Spain, Italy, and Sweden among them, Switzerland stood out. With no fortresses and no buffer zones, and surrounded by some of Europe's greatest powers, the Swiss remained free and uninvaded for over 200 years. He asked, how can anyone ridicule a militia like Switzerland's? It was this force of ordinary citizens that defeated Duke Leopold's army at Morgarten, and later crushed 20,000 Austrians at Sempach with fewer than 2,000 Swiss, and again at Nafels, just 3/4 the Swiss pushed back 8,000 invaders. The Swiss militia was ready at a moment's notice. If there was danger, the alarm system was simple: smoke by day, fire by night. Everyone knew what it meant. It was fast, effective, and deeply rooted in the idea that every citizen had a role to play in defending their country. Even political thinkers like Machiavelli admired this system. He traveled through Switzerland and studied the militia model firsthand. In his famous work, The Prince, he noted that the Swiss were well armed and enjoyed great freedom. He saw in them the spirit of the citizen soldiers of ancient Rome. In his discourses on Livy, Machiavelli argued that citizen militias were key to liberty. Mercenary armies, in contrast, led to dependency, instability, and tyranny. A nation defended by its own people, trained and prepared to protect their homeland, could avoid being at the mercy of fortune. For Machiavelli, and later for the English and American Republicans, Switzerland offered a living example, a country where freedom, duty, and self-defense were one and the same. The Swiss were often referred to as masters of modern warfare. Why? Because their political and military system was centered on the idea of an armed citizenry, a people's militia. This wasn't a force designed for conquest, but rather for defense. And that distinction mattered. States that are strongly armed, like Switzerland or ancient Rome, were incredibly difficult to defeat at home. The Swiss could only send out 30 or 40,000 men to fight abroad. But when it came to defending their own territory, they could raise over 100,000. So, the strategy was simple: wait at home, defend with strength, and never overextend. In his writings, one observer described Swiss infantry as wearing iron breastplates and carrying long pikes, spears nearly 18 feet in length, along with broadswords. Some carried halberds, a kind of axe-spear hybrid, while others wielded one of the earliest firearms, the harquebus. These weren't elite soldiers, they were ordinary citizens. Farmers, tradesmen, townsfolk, armed out of necessity, fighting to protect their homes. They couldn't afford cavalry like their wealthier neighbors, so they developed ways to defeat it from the ground. This citizen-based military model was seen as a continuation of the Roman Republic's traditions, and it deeply impressed political thinkers in later centuries. There was a clear lesson here. A nation made up of free, armed citizens was a nation capable of defending itself, without relying on standing, professional armies that could be turned against the people. That idea would go on to shape political thought across Europe and in America. In contrast to the fears of monarchs and absolutists, who often tried to disarm their citizens, Republicans argued that freedom was best preserved when the people themselves held the arms. One French thinker believed the best way to avoid rebellion was to disarm the common people. He even argued against the custom of wearing a sword in daily life, saying it led to too many murders. But this view ignored a deeper truth. The real danger wasn't from fellow citizens, but from rulers who no longer feared their own subjects. Opposing this thinking were Republicans who pointed to Switzerland as a model. In Switzerland, the people were not only armed, they had the power to question their leaders, even remove them. Their liberty was protected not by nobles or kings, but by ordinary citizens, trained and ready to defend their rights. Some political writers went so far as to argue that freedom itself required the people to hold the arms, not the government. In ancient Greece, they noted, the city-states that maintained their freedom were the ones where the citizens themselves bore arms, because whoever holds the weapons holds the power. This wasn't just theory. English thinkers, particularly those who supported constitutional government and individual liberty, were fascinated by Switzerland. They believed the Swiss were the freest people in Europe and credited that freedom to their militia. In the late 17th century, one writer praised the Swiss as the happiest and most secure people in Europe because they had the best militia. No free man should ever be denied the right to bear arms, because those arms were the true badge of liberty. Even military scholars took note. One detailed account of the Swiss wars explained how, from the very beginning, the Swiss fought without a standing army. Their wars against Austria were fought entirely by the militia, paid by the local cantons, and dismissed when the campaign ended. And yet, they became known as some of the best soldiers in Europe. The Swiss, it was said, had learned a timeless lesson. A standing army could threaten liberty. So instead, they trusted their freedom to an organized, disciplined, and deeply rooted militia, a force made up of the people themselves. That belief, and the example it set, would echo far beyond the Alps. The Bern militia was made up of nearly every man between the ages of 16 and 60. It included special units like the Fusiliers, unmarried men ready to march within an hour's notice, and the electionaries, who made up the rest. Every man supplied his own arms, and care was taken to ensure that their weapons were uniform and up to standard. An officer called the Commissioner of Arms inspected their equipment and disciplined those who failed to meet expectations. Although militias were often criticized for their lack of discipline, the Swiss addressed this by holding regular drills. Soldiers trained every Sunday and on religious holidays. Beyond that, communities had local shooting ranges where people gathered daily during certain times of the year to practice with their muskets. These weren't just drills, they were a way of life. If there was an alarm in the countryside, the entire militia would take up arms and report to their assigned rendezvous points. Orders were already in place, and the people were ready. This Swiss model inspired many thinkers beyond the Alps. A manual written in the mid-1700s demonstrated how easily everyday people, like farmers and craftsmen, could be trained in the use of arms. The author argued that if a militia were organized before an invasion, the country would be safer than any other in Europe, with Switzerland being the only exception. These writings were reprinted frequently in colonial America, where the idea of a people's army defending liberty resonated deeply. The American press picked up on these themes. One example appeared in the Boston Gazette in 1771, quoting a British political essayist who described how the people of Switzerland had suffered under Austrian rule. They endured brutal oppression until they rose up, drove out the tyrants, and secured their freedom through courage and determination. With a few hundred fighters, they defeated armies 10 or 20 times their size. This narrative of farmers defeating empires was powerful in the American colonies. The comparison to their own struggle was obvious. Stories of William Tell, who stood up to tyranny with a crossbow, weren't just folklore. They were seen as proof that liberty could triumph, even against overwhelming odds. In October of 1774, as tensions with Britain escalated, the Continental Congress issued an appeal to the people of Quebec. In it, they pointed to Switzerland as a living example of religious unity and political freedom. Despite being made up of both Catholic and Protestant cantons, the Swiss had remained united and free. This message was a call for solidarity, an attempt to rally allies around the shared value of self-governance. In 1775, an American writer of Swiss origin published a pamphlet in support of the militia's stand at Lexington. He condemned the British general in Boston for deceiving the people into surrendering their arms with a false promise of safe passage. He noted that Americans, raised from childhood with a strong sense of liberty and familiarity with firearms, had an advantage over most people of similar class elsewhere in the world. Though he would later side with Britain, his early writings supported the cause of American freedom. In one of his more powerful passages, he described how the Swiss, when attacked, fought back with incredible bravery. Surrounded by powerful monarchies like Austria, France, and Savoy, they maintained their independence through sheer determination. His closing wish, that Switzerland remain free and brave for all time. A few years later, in 1778, while the Revolutionary War still raged, a Swiss counselor wrote to Benjamin Franklin. In his letter, he proposed a lasting friendship between the new United States and Switzerland, two sister republics in a world dominated by kings. This idea of sister republics carried deep symbolic meaning. It wasn't just about diplomacy. It was a bold statement that free peoples, no matter how small, could stand together in defiance of monarchy and oppression. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 officially proclaimed that the American colonies were now free and independent states. Not long after, the Articles of Confederation, agreed upon in 1777 and taking effect in 1781, reaffirmed that independence. It stated that each state would retain its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, along with any powers not explicitly delegated to the central government. John Adams explained that no one was suggesting that the entire continent should be unified under one single national government. Instead, the prevailing idea in the Continental Congress was to follow the example of the Greeks, the Dutch, and the Swiss, to form a confederation of individual states, each with its own government. As the Revolutionary War came to a close and the idea of a stronger federal constitution began to take hold, the Swiss experience again entered the conversation. Many Americans saw similarities between their own Articles of Confederation and the Swiss Confederation. Both systems prioritized local control over centralized power. But by 1786, a movement was growing in favor of a more unified framework, still federal, but with a stronger central government. The next year, delegates would meet in Philadelphia to draft what would become the United States Constitution. During this period, both James Madison and John Adams were studying models of government from around the world. Among them was the Swiss Confederation. Madison, in a study of ancient and modern confederacies, described the Swiss as forming their union in the early 14th century, first as a temporary alliance and later as a permanent union among the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. Over time, their alliance expanded to 13 cantons, each represented in a general council or diet, with 2 deputies per canton. Madison saw the Swiss Confederation as resembling the American system under the Articles of Confederation. It lacked a centralized authority. The General Diet was essentially a congress of delegates from independent cantons. Each canton maintained its own sovereignty, and no unified national structure bound them all together. Only the original 3 cantons were directly allied to each of the others, and even then they operated more as close allies than as parts of a single nation. There was no common treasury, no unified military, no shared currency or court system. The symbols of sovereignty, those elements that bind a country together, were missing. Each of those powers remained within the cantons themselves. Still, Madison did recognize a few national characteristics. By the mid-1600s, the Swiss had established a federal army for mutual defense. They also had a long-standing agreement to support each other in the face of internal unrest or rebellion. If a revolt occurred in one canton, the others were obligated to assist in restoring order. The goal was to preserve peace and defend the form of government in each member state. Importantly, no canton was ever to be forced to send troops outside the Swiss borders, and goods moving through one canton to another could not be taxed along the way, echoing the principles that would later shape the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause. Madison identified 4 main problems, or vices, within the Swiss system. First, the cantons varied greatly in size. Second, they operated under different systems of government. Third, there was religious intolerance between cantons. And fourth, and most significantly in his view, the union was weak. John Adams, writing around the same time, was also analyzing different republics, including the Swiss. In his defense of the U.S. system, he devoted a chapter to the cantons, describing them as either democratic or aristocratic in their internal governance. Regardless of their form, 2 common elements stood out: the right to bear arms and the right to vote on laws. Adams admired the Swiss model, where even in rugged rural lands, people were educated and politically active. In many cantons, all males aged 15 or older had the right to vote in general assemblies that passed laws, raised taxes, formed alliances, and decided on war or peace. The Swiss militia system was clear. There was no standing army, but every able man was armed, trained, and ready. Their weapons were regularly inspected, and many communities practiced at local ranges. Even symbols like William Tell's bow were seen as national treasures, embodying the spirit of rebellion and self-reliance. These ideas echoed in the American debates over the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, most power remained with the states, with only a weak central authority. But at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, leaders like Alexander Hamilton pushed for stronger federal power, warning that the Swiss cantons barely functioned as a true union. James Madison agreed, fearing that too much local power would tear the new republic apart. Yet others, like Luther Martin and George Mason, defended the Swiss example. Mason argued that a free citizen fights not for a prince, but for his own rights, and that spirit had kept Switzerland independent for centuries. For the anti-federalists, the Swiss stood as a model of local strength, direct democracy, and an armed populace ready to defend its liberty. For the federalists, Switzerland was a warning of what happened when central authority was too weak. Either way, the Swiss example shaped the conversation and the foundation of the United States. The Swiss model was admired by those known as anti-federalists, though the name is somewhat misleading. These were Americans who supported strong civil liberties, an armed populace in place of a standing army, and a vision of the United States where state powers would outweigh federal authority. In contrast, the Federalists sought to centralize power and viewed the Swiss example with less enthusiasm. At the Philadelphia Convention, James Wilson was one of the first to speak publicly in defense of the proposed constitution, including support for a standing army. His position sparked a strong reaction. A pamphlet titled "A Democratic Federalist" called the standing army "that great support of tyrants," reminding readers that it was militias, not a national army, that had defeated the British at Lexington and Bunker Hill. The pamphlet praised the Swiss for maintaining their liberty without a standing army, even while surrounded by Europe's most powerful nations. The example of Switzerland, which, like us, is a republic, has preserved its freedom for many ages with the sole help of a militia. Why should we not follow so glorious an example? In November 1787, another author made the case in the New York Journal that the great republics of Greece, Rome, and Switzerland did not maintain standing armies. In Switzerland, he noted, military service was occasional, or, at most, annual. There was no permanent display of power, only the Swiss militia, yet the country remained free and formidable. Cincinnatus also criticized Wilson's defense of standing armies. In his view, such armies existed to fulfill the ambitions of rulers, were funded by burdensome taxation, and served mainly to suppress the people. The Swiss model, based on a militia of citizen soldiers, was the alternative. The example of Switzerland, which, like us, is a republic, has preserved its freedom for many ages with the sole help of a militia. Why should we not follow so glorious an example? Federalists fought back. In the Federalist number 19, James Madison, writing with Alexander Hamilton, argued that the Swiss cantons barely qualified as a confederacy. They had no common treasury, no shared troops, no unified currency or courts, and no other clear signs of sovereignty. Their cohesion, he wrote, was due more to geography and weakness than to shared government. Yet, in the Federalist number 43, Madison offered a more favorable comparison. When defending the constitutional provision allowing states to request federal assistance in times of unrest, he acknowledged that even in Switzerland, where no true central government existed, such mutual aid was common. Cantons frequently supported one another, including the most democratic ones. In the Federalist number 46, Madison addressed the fear that a federal standing army might be used to oppress the people. He pointed out that the United States would have a vast militia, nearly 500,000 citizens with arms in hand, led by officers chosen from among themselves, defending their shared liberty. He contrasted this with Europe, where governments feared to trust their citizens with weapons. The advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. Though he didn't mention Switzerland directly here, the parallel was clear. In both the Swiss and American traditions, the right and the duty of the people to bear arms was a pillar of liberty. At Connecticut's Ratification Convention in January 1788, Oliver Ellsworth, another Philadelphia delegate, argued in favor of stronger federal powers. He dismissed the Swiss model as irrelevant. They are small republics, about 20 miles square, situated among the Alps, and inaccessible to hostile attacks. They were merely herdsmen. He acknowledged their legendary military feats, like 400 mountaineers defeating an Austrian force of 15,000. But in his view, their geographical isolation, not their political system, preserved their freedom. By contrast, an anti-federalist writing under the name A Virginia Planter praised Switzerland in the Winchester, Virginia Gazette. He warned that the proposed constitution was filled with mechanisms that could shackle the liberties of freeborn Americans. Only America and Switzerland, he wrote, had managed to avoid the global tide of tyranny. All the world is now groaning in a hell of slavery, America and Switzerland excepted. James Monroe also weighed in. In a pamphlet, he warned that poorly defined boundaries between federal and state authority would create serious problems. He referenced older confederacies, Achaean, Belgic, Helvetic, as examples of leagues of independent states. He argued that the challenge for America would be to precisely balance the powers of state and federal governments to avoid one crushing the other. At the Virginia Ratification Convention, some of America's most powerful voices clashed. Patrick Henry, a fierce anti-federalist, demanded rejection of the Constitution unless it was first amended to include a Bill of Rights. In June 1788, he referred to Switzerland as evidence that America could survive without immediately ratifying the Constitution. The Swiss Confederation, he noted, was made up of very different governments, yet it endured. Switzerland stood as a symbol, used differently by each side in the debate. For some, it represented the strength of local power, citizen militias, and direct democracy. For others, it represented a warning, a system too weak, too fragmented, to govern effectively. But in all cases, it remained part of the imagination of the American founders, a reminder that liberty could be preserved not only by arms, but by the people who held them. This is a powerful example showing that governments of different structures can still form a successful confederation. The Swiss Confederation had existed for over 400 years. Some of its republics were democratic, others aristocratic, yet no harm came from that dissimilarity. Together, they had resisted the might of France and Germany across centuries. It was the Swiss spirit that kept them united, enduring immense challenges with patience and courage. Surrounded by powerful monarchies, Switzerland had maintained its independence, its simple republican ideals, and its courage. James Madison, the primary draftsman of the U.S. Constitution and a leading Federalist, argued against modeling the United States after Switzerland. He made the sharp claim that peasants in the aristocratic cantons were among the most oppressed people in Europe, nearly as much so, he said, as subjects of Eastern despots. Madison believed that it was the rigidity of aristocratic rule and the cantons' close alliances that kept the Confederation from dissolving. He also pointed to internal wars between the cantons, warning that without the constant threat of external enemies, the Confederacy might fall apart. But Patrick Henry returned to the debate with a stirring defense of the Swiss model. Famous for his cry, "Give me liberty or give me death," Henry lived up to his reputation with a passionate speech praising Switzerland. Switzerland, he said, was a confederation of 13 cantons, united for national defense. They had endured for 4 centuries, enjoying remarkable internal peace. Compared to the constant wars and civil unrest in France and Germany, the Swiss stood out as a model of stability and freedom. He spoke of the Swiss peasants, not as mercenaries, but as citizens deeply attached to their country and their liberty. Their bravery, their resolve, and their love of freedom had made them formidable. And they had succeeded not by building massive armies or backing a powerful president, but through courage, simplicity, and frugality. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Constitution would be ratified, but with a promise that a Bill of Rights would be considered by the First Congress. That promise was kept. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, included 2 amendments shaped by Swiss influence. The Second Amendment declared, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The 10th Amendment added, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." These principles, armed popular sovereignty and decentralized power, were at the heart of both the Swiss and American republican traditions. In 1792, the Federal Militia Act was passed. It required every able-bodied white male citizen aged 18 to 44 to enroll in their state militia and supply themselves with a musket, rifle, or pistol, along with appropriate ammunition and a sword. This law reflected the spirit of both the Revolution and the Swiss model. In the debate surrounding that bill, Representative James Jackson of Georgia argued passionately that Americans would never accept being denied the right to bear arms. He reminded Congress that many nations had gained their liberty because of such rights. The Swiss, he said, had freed themselves through the power of a citizen militia, rejecting tyranny through armed readiness. In a republic, Jackson argued, every man should be a soldier, prepared to resist tyranny from within as well as invasion from without. And the greatest threat of all, he warned, was a permanent standing army. The American Republic had looked to Switzerland for inspiration. In doing so, it found a symbol of freedom, of armed citizens defending their homes, their laws, and their liberty, without a king, without a professional army, and without fear. Representative Roger Sherman once said that it was the privilege of every citizen, and one of their most essential rights, to bear arms and to resist any attack on their liberty or property. Not only individuals, but the states themselves, he said, had the right to be armed and to defend their rights when under threat. With those ideals in mind, the American Republic was now officially established. But across the Atlantic, the Swiss Confederation was about to face its first successful foreign invasion, an event that would resonate deeply in the young United States. At first, many Americans had cheered the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. But their enthusiasm faded quickly with the rise of violence and extremism. By 1793, the execution of Louis XVI and France's wars with Britain and Holland forced American sympathizers to reconsider. President George Washington issued a formal proclamation of neutrality. Thomas Jefferson noted that the war between France and Britain stirred the American public far more than anything else had, dividing political opinion with unexpected intensity. But that same year, Maximilien Robespierre took a different stance. He publicly opposed calls for French intervention in Switzerland. A law was passed mandating strict respect for the French Republic's treaties of friendship with its sister republics, the United States and Switzerland. The law stated that France would appear terrifying to her enemies, generous to her allies, and just to all people. It promised that France would faithfully uphold her treaties with the United States and the Swiss cantons. Despite these promises, tensions in Europe kept rising. The United States remained firm in its commitment to neutrality. In his farewell address of 1796, President Washington warned against foreign entanglements. Europe, he said, had its own set of primary interests, ones that had little or no connection to the concerns of the United States. Getting caught up in the endless cycles of European politics, he cautioned, would be a grave mistake. But conflict still came. When the U.S. signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, a treaty that France viewed as too favorable to their enemy, relations between France and the United States soured. France suspended diplomatic relations and began targeting American ships. President John Adams, newly elected in 1797, warned Congress of the growing danger. The French were outraged. Around that same time, reports emerged that Napoleon was furious with Switzerland for refusing to let French troops pass through its territory. He even threatened to take by force what diplomacy had failed to secure. In what became known as the XYZ affair, French agents demanded huge bribes from American diplomats, along with support in France's war against England. The Americans flatly refused. One of the diplomats noted that France seemed determined to treat America the same way it had treated Switzerland, by denying it the right to remain neutral. President Adams, upon learning of the French demands, expressed his fears that even the courage and poverty of the Swiss might not protect them from being divided and conquered. By early 1798, reports in the American press announced that war between France and Bern was inevitable. The Swiss city of Arau had already been captured, and supporters of France in the region of Vaud joined French troops marching toward Bern. The official reason for the French invasion was said to be the killing of 2 French soldiers by Swiss guards, but many saw this as little more than a pretext. One report noted how the French, rather than viewing the Swiss as rebels, considered them worthy opponents. In a particularly dramatic account, it was said that 80 young men of Bern defended a narrow pass with such bravery that, though they were all killed, they left many French soldiers dead behind them. During this time, an American envoy met with a French agent who claimed that Switzerland would be forced to provide money to France, and that the United States must do the same or suffer the consequences. The agent accused both the Washington and Adams administrations of being completely pro-British. Back in the U.S., political divisions grew sharper. The Federalist Party, led by President Adams, supported a stronger central government and was often sympathetic to Britain. The Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson, opposed centralized power and had originally supported the French Revolution. Federalists in Congress were quick to seize on the French invasion of Switzerland to argue their case. Representative Robert Harper of South Carolina spoke in the House of Representatives, accusing France of trying to strip Switzerland of its independence. He told of how the French drove out Swiss magistrates, seized territory, and crushed opposition. But when the Swiss rose up to fight back, he said the French were forced to withdraw and restore the local government. Harper urged Americans to learn from the Swiss. The time had come, he said, to resist foreign aggression, to declare that while peace was good, independence was better. Harper may have been too optimistic. News from Europe traveled slowly, and the full extent of the French occupation wasn't yet known in America. In truth, the French were still advancing, and Switzerland was being forcibly transformed. Still, Harper's message struck a chord. For many in the United States, the fall of the Swiss Confederation served as a grim warning that neutrality and freedom could not be taken for granted, and that a citizenry prepared to defend itself was essential to preserving both. Things did not turn out well for Switzerland. On March 8, 1798, John Marshall wrote to President John Adams, expressing that there was little hope of settling tensions with France without compromising American independence. France was demanding money from the United States to help fund its war efforts. Marshall also noted the looming influence of the French Revolution on Switzerland. In the region of Vaud, belonging to the canton of Bern, a revolution had already begun, backed by French troops. That small area had already paid an enormous price, nearly 800,000 Swiss livres, to host the foreign army. France was now insisting that revolution be extended throughout all of Switzerland. Some of the cantons, including Bern, expressed willingness to reform their governments, promising more equality and democratic representation. but they firmly protested any outside interference. In fact, most of the population in Bern stood with the government, vowing to fight to the last man rather than allow foreigners to dictate their political future. It was a dire moment. A large French military force was moving toward the region. Though negotiations were said to be starting, the terms France offered were more akin to those given to a defeated enemy. A revolutionary government was being demanded, and despite Switzerland's efforts to remain neutral, both during the recent Continental War and after the peace, they were now facing consequences that no neutral nation should. 2 days after sending that letter, Marshall noted in his diary that French and Swiss troops had clashed, with the Swiss suffering heavy losses. Fribourg and Solothurn had already fallen. There were even rumors, unconfirmed at the time, that Bern had submitted. By May, American newspapers reported events from March. The French General Schauenberg had announced his army's entrance into Lucerne after fierce resistance from the Swiss. One dramatic report stated that local women had joined the fight, charging French troops with scythes in hand and cutting down many of them. In another act of defiance, during a battle near Nevenek, Swiss peasants, despite being untrained and poorly armed, fought so fiercely that they refused to surrender. Some even threw themselves onto the ground to block the advance of French artillery. But by June, the truth was out. Bern had indeed surrendered back in mid-March. The terms were humiliating. The city was forced to house 4,000 French foot soldiers and 1,000 cavalry. All citizens, urban and rural, were disarmed. The city's arsenal was handed over. A provisional national assembly replaced the existing government, and a new Helvetic constitution, imposed from Paris, was to be accepted without debate. Back in the United States, the release of the XYZ dispatches in April 1798 sparked outrage. The documents revealed French agents attempting to extort bribes and loans from the American diplomats in Paris. Public support surged behind President Adams and the Federalists, who pushed forward plans in Congress to create a navy and a standing army in preparation for possible war. James Madison, in a private letter to Thomas Jefferson, expressed dismay that Adams, once a leading figure in the American Revolution, was now supporting such measures. Adams had gone so far as to claim that there wasn't a single shared principle between the American and French revolutions. Ignoring the obvious, both had overthrown monarchies. When the House of Representatives debated bills to arm the militia and establish a standing army, Federalist leader Robert Harper referenced the Swiss. He argued that the brave efforts of Bern's citizens, fighting with scythes and pitchforks, were not enough. No amount of spirit or patriotism, he claimed, could replace the discipline of a professional army. The Swiss, he said, were crushed because their government lacked decisive action and their troops lacked training. Republicans disagreed. Representative Nathaniel Macon argued that Harper was avoiding the real issue, the Constitution, and using the fall of Bern as a scare tactic. He believed that the army of volunteers being proposed would violate the Constitution. Albert Gallatin, a Swiss-born representative from Pennsylvania and now a leader among the Republicans, echoed this sentiment. He dismissed all talk of the Swiss example as irrelevant to the question at hand. In June 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, driven by the Federalists. These laws gave the president sweeping power to detain and deport foreign nationals and to silence political critics. Under the Sedition Act, newspapers could be censored and writers imprisoned for what they printed. The Federalists, emboldened by public fear and outrage, saw Switzerland's collapse not as a lesson in foreign aggression, but as an argument for a stronger central authority at home. But for the Republicans, it was proof of what could happen when liberty was sacrificed in the name of order. The Swiss had fought bravely, with men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, and though they had fallen under French power, their example still stirred deep emotions in those who believed that the true defense of freedom lies in the people themselves. The Republicans charged that Federalist leaders were using the Alien and Sedition Acts to suppress political opposition. Thomas Jefferson believed that one of the targets was Albert Gallatin himself. In response, Jefferson and James Madison drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, declaring the acts unconstitutional and contrary to the Bill of Rights. Jefferson outlined the Republican stance in a letter written in January 1799. He made clear his preference for internal defense through the militia alone, except in case of actual invasion, and called for only a modest naval force to protect America's coasts and harbors. He opposed a standing army during peacetime, fearing it might overawe public sentiment. He also warned against entangling the United States in European conflicts, stating firmly, "I am not for linking ourselves by new treaties with the quarrels of Europe." He stood for freedom of the press and against silencing criticism of government through force rather than reason. On February 25, 1799, the House of Representatives took up a report in response to petitions signed by thousands of citizens calling for the repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The report defended the legislation and accused the petitioners of undermining efforts to resist French aggression, including the buildup of a navy, the establishment of a standing army, and the taxes required to support both. The report argued that the acts did not violate constitutional rights to free speech or a free press. It framed libels against the government as punishable offenses, not protected expression. To justify this, the report painted a grim picture of the era's global conflicts, declaring, "A contest has arisen and rages with unabated ferocity, which has desolated the fairest portions of Europe." Citing French invasions in Egypt, the East Indies, and the Ottoman Empire, it warned Americans not to fall for the illusion that republics were safe from French hostility. Switzerland, once neutral and proud, had been seduced, divided, disarmed, and ultimately crushed. This irony was not lost on political observers. The Federalists, who now used the Swiss example to defend central authority and national security, had never been enthusiastic about Swiss-style federalism or the armed citizenry. Republicans, on the other hand, despite their earlier admiration for the French Revolution, continued to praise Switzerland's traditional values: federalism, local militias, and national neutrality. The Federalist Report also invoked fears of French spies and internal subversion, portraying the Alien and Sedition Acts as essential national defenses. Albert Gallatin pushed back hard. He insisted that the president had no constitutional authority to expel peaceful immigrants, and that these acts were more in line with the unchecked powers of the British Parliament than with American principles. He condemned how liberty of the press had been construed away by Star Chamber definitions, invoking the oppressive history of Britain's old royal courts. Gallatin saw the acts and the standing army, the taxes, and the efforts to centralize power as part of a broader pattern of domestic oppression. He scoffed at comparisons between America and Egypt, pointing out that Egypt was ruled by Mamelukes and inhabited by slaves, while America was still defended by its people. Despite these protests, the Federalists refused to debate. By a narrow vote, 52 to 48, the House adopted the committee's report and rejected any repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The laws would remain in effect until their expiration in 1801. Meanwhile, Switzerland remained at the heart of Europe's battlefield. Throughout 1799, Swiss territory was ravaged by the French and their enemies, England, Austria, and Russia. American newspapers tracked the developments closely. One report even speculated that if Switzerland were completely conquered, the French might impose a new federal constitution modeled on that of the United States. The most dramatic moment of the campaign was the daring march of Russian General Suvorov across the treacherous Gotthard Mountains. The French were driven out of Uri, but the price was devastating. American newspapers described the horror: empty villages, desolate farms, no provisions, no livestock. Mount St. Gotthard, one paper wrote, was covered in blood and corpses, a grim reminder of what Switzerland's independence had cost. The Alien and Sedition Acts played a central role in the defeat of John Adams during the presidential election of 1800. In his inaugural address of 1801, Thomas Jefferson offered a clear vision for the new republic: peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, a well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war until regulars may relieve them. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person. Jefferson's words reaffirmed the nation's commitment to neutrality and the principles laid out in the Bill of Rights. While France never invaded the United States, Britain did during the War of 1812. At the same time, in 1813, Switzerland once again became a battleground in the struggle among French, Austrian, and Russian forces. And yet, both countries, Switzerland and the United States, emerged from these foreign invasions stronger, each in its own way. Both continued their traditions of neutrality. The United States, however, would eventually break from that tradition in the 20th century, not by choice, as the attack on Pearl Harbor would prove. To this day, only Switzerland maintains a militia-based military system. While the United States still recognizes the concept of an unorganized militia in federal and state law, it relies instead on a professional standing military. Still, both countries uphold the right of citizens to bear arms, and despite the ever-growing scale of the federal government in America, both nations have maintained the core framework of federalism: sovereignty shared between national and regional governments. In a much later chapter of American constitutional history, one case brought the legacy of federalism, alongside echoes of the Swiss experience, into the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1997, the court heard the case of Sheriff J. Prince v. United States, which dealt with whether the federal government could compel state and local law enforcement officers to carry out background checks for handgun purchases. During oral arguments, a justice asked, "Why don't we let the federal government issue directives to the states, as is done in Switzerland, Germany, or the European Union?" The response was clear: our nation must follow its own constitution, not borrow models from abroad. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of the sheriffs. Writing for the majority, Justice Antonin Scalia held that the federal government cannot conscript states into carrying out federal regulatory programs. He referred back to the debates over the U.S. Constitution in 1787 and 1788, noting how the Anti-Federalists pointed to Switzerland, then a 4-century-old Confederate republic, as proof that a centralized federal government was not the only way to preserve liberty and sovereignty. Justice Stephen Breyer, in dissent, looked to modern European systems, where member states often implement laws passed by central authorities. He pointed out that in Switzerland, Germany, and the European Union, constituent states carry out many national policies themselves. However, he did not address the constitutional risks of letting Congress hand down directives to the states without limit or compensation. Nor did he reflect on the vast historical differences among those European systems. Switzerland to this day remains the Confederation Helvetia, a structure where the central government is limited and the cantons retain significant autonomy. Germany, while now federal, had its state powers stripped under the Nazi regime. And the European Union stands as a centralized, unelected bureaucracy that the Swiss people, valuing their independence, chose not to join. Ironically, the sister republics, Switzerland and the United States, may have more in common in principle than some modern analyses suggest. Though the U.S. Constitution was passed despite the objections of the anti-federalists, those critics did succeed in shaping the final form of the Republic. Their influence brought about the Bill of Rights, including 2 amendments deeply inspired by the Swiss model. The Second Amendment, affirming the importance of a well-regulated militia and the right to keep and bear arms, and the 10th Amendment, reserving to the states or the people those powers not delegated to the federal government. In that sense, the vision of Patrick Henry and the anti-federalists was not lost. They brought part of the Swiss tradition of federalism and armed, engaged citizenship into the foundation of American democracy, traditions that continue to resonate today.